Merci, merci beaucoup, merci. Bon, on a pris 15 minutes de retard, mais ce n'est pas un vrai retard. Vous avez la possibilité d'écouter des collègues.
We're now running 15 minutes late. Merci. So we're going to listen to some brilliant speakers now. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the Scientific Committee for having agreed to host this rather original subject for our workshop. So I'm going to ask Georges to present the colleagues, our friend Michaël BISCH, who's traveled through France and Switzerland in the storm. He just arrived for dessert yesterday, and he's leaving in a moment, and he'll have a bit of sun on his way back. He's a psychologist and addictologist, worked in Nancy, and has come across the Alps so to get back to his area. And Professor Franchitto from Toulouse is a great specialist of rugby. Of course, he's from Toulon, so you can now have to work out how you can sort that out with the Basques. He knows the subject because he's an expert on the subject. And Georges is going to be speaking, so he's not only going to be chairing the session or co-chairing the session with me, but you know George on dual pathologies. They have no secret for him. And of course, he's also going to be talking, and he's going to has to leave us before the end of the session because he's got to drive back to his to the Auvergne where he was born. So, Georges, you can say something. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizing committee of ATHS for allowing me to, and all the organizing committee allowing us to organize this session on sport and addiction. I'd like to thank Amine, my friend Amine BENYAMINA, to co-chair this with. He's the president of France Addiction. And it's on prevention, of course, this session, and the question of doping and substance use in sport, and particularly around sport, as we will see. To begin with, I'm from Clermont, so Clermont-Ferrand. When you see, I was given some blue and white drink, so I'd like to congratulate Bayonne for their recent victory, and also Aurillac for having beaten Biarritz in rugby. But this is rugby, and I'm very happy to welcome here my colleagues and friends who are interested in sport and this great school of life that sport is, and of course everything that can be connected with mental health and addiction. So I'm perhaps going to you take this microphone here. I think that'll be simpler. So, Georges, you're going to have maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Try and do it in 20 minutes, and we'll see, because we are a bit behind schedule. For the beginning of the session, I'm going to present a prevention program of addiction in the sports environment set up in Clermont-Ferrand, which is called PAMS. It's a fund against addiction. The funding wasn't continued. We asked for another program. So this is what happens with this kind of funding. But we hope that we're going to relaunch this PAMS program because a number of stakeholders were very happy with the program. And Michaël BISCH was particularly associated with this. And so I'm going to be talking about that. I don't have any links for this presentation, no interest and no conflict of interest. So there are people have been working for 18 years in prevention of addiction, and we've done a lot of research with students, research and interventions with students, and particularly in secondary schools, and also historically in professionals and amateurs in sports clubs, because we have been asked by them. So a certain number of psychologists working in our unit have done high-level sport, notably in horse riding and athletics. And we were asked to work in schools and with sports clubs on the question of prevention. So what is prevention for sport? The first question is sport a risk factor or a protection factor for addictive behavior? Of course, you'll say both, and we'll see that the question of sport, and around sport there can be addictive risks and substance use phenomena, which may be around sport, maybe in sport, because high-level sportsmen are not spared, no more than the general population, from the consumption of psychoactive substances. And sport, as a psychosocial vector, it's emblematic of health, can, of course, be a good lever for the prevention of addictive habits. Physical activity, you know what it is. We can see the emulation around physical activity, particularly since the Olympic Games, and I think that's why we've talked about this question a lot recently, and the question of addiction in sport, because we have all the enthusiasm around the Olympic Games. But around sport, of course, there's physical activity, and it's perhaps not the subject here, but physical activity in addiction plays a particular role. We can see this in our patient with the increasing development of sports teachers who work with addicts, and the interest of developing these practices in managing use disorders, and particularly for cocaine. We can see the interest that physical activity can represent for this management of addictive behaviors. A certain number of elements can help us to link the fact that practicing sport and can be connected with addictive behaviors. Sports is associated with a certain number of rewards connected with our human activities, with food and sexual activities and social interactions, a certain number of phenomena, and we can put physical activity and sport in this list of human reward processes, and these behaviors can become addictive because of the mobilization of memorization and pleasure and motivation and behavioral repetition. And we can see a certain number of individuals who become addicts of their own sports activity. Well, these are phenomena that we could consider as being equivalent to addiction, and then the substance use in the sports environment. Now, this is fairly recent, talking about addiction in sports, since a certain number of athletes themselves have declared that they had problems of addiction or mental health. Of course, in their careers, there's some emblematic stories of people who are using a lot of substances, which hit the headlines, particularly with putting a spotlight in the media because it's rather sensational. And again, you need to look at substance use in the sports environment, just as substance use in other areas. And we have to be very vigilant with regard to a certain number of events that get in the limelight in the media, because around certain sportsmen and sportswomen, there is a certain amount of sensationalism. But we can see, for example, about depression and substances. A certain number of videos talk about this. Is Camille Lacour talking about his addiction at the end of his career. And since athletes have started talking about that, there's been an interest not only in addiction during the sportsman or sportswoman's career, but also in their transition phase. And for high-level athletes, the transition phase was a very important element where there could be, as Camille Lacour said, they found themselves with no goal in life, and nothing to get up for, and a career that stops at around 30 or 35 years of age for certain athletes. So for a certain number of us who are associated with sports clubs, we could see high-level sportsmen and sportswomen, when they're confronted with injuries, particularly towards the end of their career, can have transitions which are very painful, and they need support. So psychological health of athletes is very important, and it can explain addictive behaviors in these environments. We have data which I could look at this publication, Vincent Goutebarge, he's from Auvergne, and I would suggest that you could read his papers. He's written a number of articles, published a number of articles with mental health data on sports people. 34% of Olympic athletes suffer from anxiety and depression during their career, but also after their career, with issues on sleep disorders. And the substances that are most widely used by athletes, which are listed: alcohol, nicotine, cannabis, and stimulants, and anabolic steroids, and cocaine. The data from a review of the literature carried out by Vincent Goudebard shows that before and after, we can't see it during because you can't see it very clearly on the slide, but what you need to bear in mind is that despite everything, whether it's during their career or after their career, or for sleep disorders, or anxiety and depression, or abuse of alcohol, we can see that we have a trend towards consumption, which doesn't stop at the end of the career. And actually, it may continue very significantly. And in this review of the literature, mental health issues with elite athletes, about 19% for alcohol abuse and 34% for anxiety and depression. That's a third of them, and that continues after the end of their careers, and it remains stable for alcohol abuse and for anxiety and depression. So this means overall that the data that we have is fairly recent, because actually there's been a focus on this only very recently. 2018, 2020, there's substance abuse in athletes, but also in trainers and coaches, and also as abuse exists in the general population, you have to bear in mind that it's a general population, it's both a general population and they are athletes as well. So the sports environment is an expression of what happens in the general population with a bit more, probably because there's psychological suffering, there's more stress, and probably the search for performance, which is associated with the practice of high-level sport. So why can sport be a risk for these individuals? I've just explained, because there's the question of the search for performance. But if you ask about sport as a risk for addiction among athletes, then we look at individuals, products, substances, and environments. We can see the individuals are valorized for for sport, the substances, not necessarily for athletes, for people in the sports environment. We can see the valorization of athletes and products are very often symbolical, and the environments, cultural environments connected to substance use, we can see in advertising around sport, the use of sport as a form of publicity to encourage people to consume substances. If we look at athletes and in sport, risky sport, it can be a risk for addiction for athletes themselves. There are a certain number of factors, which are individual factors and which may encourage the appearance of addictive behavior. For example, focus on sport, which requires performance, injuries, which are frequent, as I mentioned a moment ago, the management of failure and victories and triumphs for sportsmen, stopping sport, the transition phases have a major impact, poor stress management, and the environment, of course, there's a whole culture with substance consumption cultures which are major in some areas, and perhaps to confront a disciplinary environment, which is sometimes difficult to deal with. And a certain number of sports, the sportsmen are uprooted, and these can be factors for environmental stress and the peer pressure, the coaches and pressure from the coaches and media. Another thing to bear in mind is that sport as a social determiner is dual, ambivalent, and paradoxical. That's what I said since the beginning. Sport encourages the consumption of substances because of the affect around sport, but sport also limits the risk of addiction because of the symbolism of well-being that comes from the practice of sport. So there is one central point. It's both a factor in prevention by using sport, but also prevention around sport, mobilizing a certain number of parameters to avoid sport from becoming a vector for the consumption of substances. So that's why you need prevention programs in the sports environment. We proposed a program in 2020 based on prevention of addictions in the sports environment, around sport, in sport, with all the phenomena of consumption amongst supporters, in sport, around sport, and with sport, because sport is a factor for health, which can encourage in young people good health and help to prevent consumption of substances. So it's ambivalent. So the element that we started out with is that we can look at all the aspects of sport. We're not used to doing this. We have the idea of primary prevention, secondary prevention, which is to avoid the effects of illness, or thirdly, to prevent the risks of relapse, or universal prevention for the whole population, or selective prevention based on an exposed population, as we have here, to have an idea of the studies of what prevention can represent. But it's important to try, particularly when you're talking to young people, to produce preventive health behaviors, that is, behaviors that are likely to lead to a reduction in the number and seriousness of any disorder. So to produce these preventive behaviors, it's extremely difficult. We know that a certain number of people will say, for example, to have preventive health behavior, you could say, if you smoke, you're likely to get a cancer, so don't smoke. So that's the basic idea of kind of prevention. We know that doesn't work very well. This is data from prevention from the 1960s. The first models for behavior change, it can be preventive education, saying if you use substances during sport, there's a risk of depression. If you consume substances during a match, there's a risk of having a road accident on the way back. So it's important to do that. There's preventive education, but it's level one, if you like, of prevention. And then there's the idea of producing favorable health behaviors to give individuals the ability to increase their control of their factors that are decisive on their health. Of course, it's not only just that kind of prevention, but it's looking at promotion of health and increasing the health determinants and encourage behaviors. And we can see this like theories of social psychology that can bring elements, can help us understand how we should act on the determinants for individuals. And risk reduction is another way of preventing risks, and which is used a lot in addictology. So to produce or change a behavior, we obviously need to try to understand the determinants of health behavior. If we want to change the behavior of individual, why people don't use condoms, or why do they smoke or not smoke, you have to understand what is the origin of their behavior. So you have to understand the factors involved in that behavior and then validate models that enable us to change those behaviors, and then try and design methods which will help them to change. Interventions, going into the classroom, telling young people that historically was kind of being like a policeman. Could we do better now, working with them with questionnaires, quizzes, and so on? Give them goodies, and we could talk about substance use. But these are tools for prevention, which it's very important to use. But all the stakeholders know all these elements that I'm just presenting. Of course, we need to have standardized assessment of these interventions. This is what we want to do with the PAMS program. And we have to bear in mind that for a long time, the main errors that were made by people was to think that people, if they had behaviors which were favorable to health or unfavorable to health, this was mediated by the idea that people had of their health. So if I don't take cocaine, it's because I'm afraid that it could be bad for my health. Or if I stop drinking, it's because I think that it's not good for my health. But we know increasingly that people, when they stop drinking, do that simply because they want to get their driving license back, but not get a better health. Or people who use condoms or not not necessarily for reasons linked to a health behavior. You have to bear this in mind because it's very often irrational or not necessarily directly connected with health behaviors, and the prevention actions have to take account of these models. These models have changed over time since the 1960s. To begin with, we had an idea that a certain number of health behaviors were connected with social learning. Why do I do something? Because my peers do the same and I do the same as them. Or it can also modify my health. For some time too, we focused on the belief in health and good health. The sports model, of course, was a model that we relied on. If I do sport, I'm going to be in good health, and valorizing health through sport. So we use sport as a prevention model in the same way as with risk behaviors. We can work, and we worked on the question of risky behaviors, but we could do sport to be in good health, but have risky behaviors. People are doing skiing outside ski resorts, maybe much better skiers than I am, but they ski much better than myself, and yet they take a lot more risks than I do. but perhaps I have more risk of falling off my skis than an off-piste skier. But there are all sorts of questions of why we adopt risky behaviors. What is it that means that in this behavior, this behavior is chosen maybe for good health or bad health? The theories that we've relied on the most today to set up prevention techniques in health and generally is planned behavioral theory, the theories of perhaps the 1980s and 1990s, which lead us to think about why people adopt certain behaviors. They do that because they have representations around that behavior, not necessarily connected with their health. And then what is it that is the trigger to the realization of this behavior? So there's so many questions about the behavioral intention, and so we can look at these intention plans. And there are social standards, social pressure, which can explain why we might adopt specific behavior in favor of good health. So the questions of psychosocial skills, you know, the major point today that the development of these psychosocial skills represent in terms of prevention, and the prevention in schools, for example, it's with the idea we should develop psychosocial skills, learn how to say no, have the ability in the group to assert your position and to determine your position with regard to substances and so on. This is something which is developed on the basis of all these theories that I've just presented. Of course, the theories of behavior change, which are very important theories for the way in which we can model prevention aspects, but this is already with consumers who have been using substances for some time. This is kind of secondary or tertiary prevention, and also some very integrative prevention, like this program, Unplugged, to try and modify their behavior. With the advantage of Unplugged, it's several sessions which can change behaviors in individuals with strong social learning and learning theories which are shared, particularly on puzzle learning models. And the difficulty with these models is to implement them in the national education system and make sure that teams of teachers participate and adhere to the model, and that's one of the limits for this model to be implemented either in a sports environment or an education environment, because when you're doing prevention in an environment, the educators or other people involved need to be able to appropriate the prevention tool that is being offered. So the PAMS program, in a few words, because we proposed this, what we wanted to do was to have a program of information through tutorials, through the social networks, and then it was also a program of training for sports coaches to disseminate prevention information to amateur sportsmen and also high-level sportsmen and sportswomen, and also prevention for the career transitions for high-level sportsmen. So it was a program around sport concerning information, using athletes speaking about questions of addiction, and this was disseminated to young people. And then it was a program in sport with training for coaches so that they can discuss with athletes about substance use, and also there was this career transition aspect with high-level sports for these career transitions. So we worked to build up tools based on the theories that I've just presented, and we worked on planned behavior theories to work on motivations, to subjective standards associated with sport, intention modes that they can discuss during group sessions with the coaches to try and see how individuals could change their behavior, and particularly their risky behaviors and their use behaviors. So what we needed to do was to look at attitudes, beliefs, and values. Why do you take cocaine or whatever substances? Because it makes my performance better in sports. So you have to reduce the beliefs in these on the positive attitudes towards these psychoactive substances. Also look at group standards with regard to these substances, and also look at the ability of individuals to control, having the psychosocial skills with regard to substances, the ability to say no to substance use. The program, this PAMS program, you'll still find it on the network. There are still some videos which are there with a certain number of tutorials where we questioned and targeted a certain number of stakeholders who talked about substance use. I don't have time to go into that. And there's a PAMS YouTube, a whole program around the development of prevention in the sports environment and around sport with interviews, witness accounts, rugbymen, rugby players and so on who'd been through the end of their careers with substance use. So very touching and emotional contributions to build up a message for prevention, both for athletes themselves and also for young people. Particularly Pat Bernard, who's a former rugby player, Pat Bernard, very touching contribution, talking very openly about his experience of addictive behavior and when he finished his sports career. During the 3 years when the program was active and funded, we gradually increased the number of publications on social networks. Until 2024, we have a certain number of social networks. This was a team of young people that we recruited. We had specialists of IT, we had psychologists, we had some older people like myself to discuss things with them about their contents. But it was more a dynamic that was supported by messages which were very short. You know about that. Of course, this goes very much into the social networks with a lot of views, which increased over time. So those were the program messages. Then we did some group work and coaching of protective environments for sportsmen. We worked with coaches. We worked with the regional rugby league in Rhône-Alpes region. So we had 2 days when we could discuss the issue of addiction, screen risky behavior in sports, and try and understand the motivations for change, how sportsmen could consume substances and then change with regard to that communication, that consumption, and communicate on consumption. The program was stopped, but our goal is to work particularly with Clermont-Ferrand about messages for the general public and discussion with high-level rugby players and amateur rugby players about substance use. I'm going to stop now. I think I have to stop. So this was a program that was very much developed in Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes. We wanted to amplify this nationally. That was not selected for various reasons, which you can understand, of course, but I hope that we're going to be able to continue to propose something of the same kind around this question of the prevention of addiction in the sports environment. So we've taken part in various events around sport for prevention, in certain conferences and sports events. And there's some websites, I think I have to go because you can find all the accounts, but I think my time has run out, so I think I'm going to have to stop. These prevention actions, and there's a feedback on those, and you'll find that again on the networks. Thank you. Yes, stay here, keep the microphone. Because you're leaving before the end of the session to drive off, perhaps going to ask you some questions now connected with your presentation. Do you have any remarks or observations or questions that you'd like to ask Professor Georges Brousse about the PAMS program and the rest of the presentation? So he can't stay to the end, so now's the time. Thank you, Georges, for this presentation, which was just to sports people. Did you look for, or did you have the possibility of looking at the addiction to sport? Not directly, but when we looked at the question of transition phases for high-level athletes, we had less addiction to sport. It's obviously more present with people who are practicing sport, but not necessarily high-level athletes, but individual sport. That's the case, but that's when people come in to consult. Historically in Clermont-Ferrand, as no doubt in other places, we had a consultation for doping, sports, and addiction, and this was funded, and that was gradually stopped, but we met people who suffered from addiction to sport, very often runners, but we didn't really target that, even if there was an intervention around the addiction to sport itself. But it was more substance addiction that was the first, the top subject. This is a question that I'd like to mention when I could like to clarify something and to see what is the perimeter that we're operating in. There's the question of addiction in sport, which concerns high-level sports people, but not only. It could be amateur sports people, people go running on Sunday, and addiction to sport, which is a different question. Sometimes it's called bigorexia, which is a very specific area. So those are two completely different focuses. Sometimes they can be confused, but I think it's important to make that distinction. And then the high-level sports people, very often what we call the third half-time, as we call it. There are issues that Georges is an expert on, of comorbidity. There are psychiatric issues with narcissism and so on, with substance use and disorders. And very clearly, this is what we see in the news and so on, but the lack of interest that society has, when they're no longer in the public eye, they put on weight and they get older, and there's nothing planned for that. So clearly, in terms of public health, if as doctors and health professionals, the former sports people who are beginning to sound the alarm, say what happens afterwards, and I think that's very important, and these are very different areas for work. Any more questions? Melina? Just a very quick question, because I have some experience of prevention with young people in Bordeaux-Bègles. And I said, well, I didn't talk about gambling connected with sport. Is that something which came into your study? Yes, that was very, very interesting. We have the account of a footballer from Clermont who was addicted to sports gambling, and you can very often see behavioral addiction and addiction to sport with players. And we're following up a certain number of them who are interested. I'd say that the interest in sport and their sport, and the interest in mobilizing around sports gambling, I think, is something we certainly do see. They gamble on other things. They look at sport, and they gamble maybe on other sports. So that's a practice which is very important, and prevention and management, which needs to be set up for high-level sports people. I would ask whether there is a gender difference in addiction for high-level sports people, particularly with regard to the cultural standards. Yes, I think probably it's fairly complex in high-level sports people. We've been following up male teams, but also female teams. It's more difficult, I think, the difficulty is to see in the amateur clubs or high-level clubs to be associated with this discussion. That's very difficult. We can't really know what the situation is. It's more difficult still today to work on the question of prevention in more female sports environment. Actually, people don't come to us very often with those issues, perhaps because there are fewer sports women, perhaps, but also maybe there are fewer problems. Maybe there'll be cultural elements, environmental issues, which are very important from that point of view. Thank you, George. And yeah, another question. Very quickly, I'm a military psychiatrist. Just to talk about that and perhaps broaden the discussion, it's very true with people who have rhythms which are in a very clear framework and very intense. But we can see the same thing in a military environment. People in operations, sometimes there can be a massive collapse, even involving their identity, and maybe it can have the same consequences for their transitions. And I think that people think about people who have very codified rhythms of life, and when they suddenly change, they're confronted with the same kind of challenges. Okay, George?
Du professeur
Thank you. We will now proceed with the presentation by Professor Franchitto, who's an specialist in addictology of the Toulouse University Hospital and who supports the National Rugby League. And, okay, so up to you, Nicolas. Yes, first of all, so the title of your presentation is The Addictologists, What Roles and What Can We Offer Sports People? The subtitle, sorry. In fact, well, good morning, everyone. I would now like to defend the rugby in a region where rugby is king and the key sport. And as an introduction, of course, these headlines that you may have seen, cocaine, rugby, smells of powder. So we all have seen these headlines pointing out the use of substances among sports people and rugby players. So I would like to, here is an article that my friend Roland Cardilla, who said we should not say that rugby is the black sheep of powder using, because journalists said that there's a lot of cocaine use in rugby. Still, all these negative images are a source of trouble because now parents in rugby schools, whereas the benefits, we all know about the benefits of rugby for children, which is a group sport that develops self-confidence, but we have also seen emerging these different issues. The fact, the problem of concussions, alcohol during third half time, the weight differences. Also, we see just on looking at 12-year-old children, you can see my son on the left, who is opposed to this massive other player. And so, of course, on concussions, as you can see, they are not wearing helmets. I've been speaking of brain concussions. This is extremely important. And also about tooth protection. And say, but I mean, he's an addictologist. Why is he speaking of brain concussions and tooth protection? But still, that makes sense. Here also, I have lots of friends in Toulon. I'm a Toulon supporter. I think probably Professor BENYAMINA as well. So what do we do actually on the field? So after, in the face of the difficulties that we have seen, there have been important affairs in the world of rugby. And the National Rugby League asks us, what can you do as addictologists? And so with Mr. BENYAMINA, we said we want to be independent. This is very important for us to intervene. If I want to compare this with addict doctors who come and to consult us in hospital, we also have this problem where the professional player has a sponsor. He wants the procedure to remain confidential. There's a precedent. He has sports managers who do not work according to English managers. Sometimes say, oh, no, we didn't know that these people were allowed to take, medical leave, for example. So we said we want to remain independent, and we used the model of addictology to the National Rugby League, and they told us this will not function. Still, this functions. As you've seen, 22 professional clubs. So that means 24 club physiologists and physiotherapists. And these were the people who were closer to the players. And we asked them, has practice been modified by recent events? And half of them answered no. So what can we see among players? What you can see here, well, the typical troubles mentioned are anxiety. They were free to write what they wanted, but what they would essentially quote is anxiety for performance. Michaël will tell you more later on. Depression syndrome, addiction that comes as third position, psychological suffering, somatic trouble, and the sleep disorders, overtraining, burnout, mood disorders. And what Professor Fatih said earlier, we haven't spoken so much about financial issues in connection with the sports, gambling. We know that clubs pay for the players' debts. And you may have heard of these Montauban players who said that actually he took some money from the players' community fund to pay for his gambling debts. So lots of players come and explain their problems, and this helps us a lot. The issue is that most professional and hope future professional players must come and discuss about their pathological disorders, and among which addiction. And there's a distinction between top 14 and pro second division, because most of the interviews are carried out by the health physiologist and psychologist. For addictions, among those addictions, we have alcohol, drugs, video games, gambling, drugs including tramadol, but also benzodiazepines and other medication, among which pregabalin, which is now more and more frequent, sex, tobacco, going out, social media, and all those different forms. What we want to have is to have an integrated follow-up, and this is what we're trying to do for our young doctors, training doctors, or pharmacists, is to have a unique file per person. We now have some training doctors, fellows who are in Toulouse, and then they move to another region, and there's no follow-up. And sometimes you have some of those fellows arriving with their addictive pathologies, and without having any follow-ups. They would like to have a follow-up from the rugby school up to the end of the player's career. So what we have learned from that is that it is psychological, which is disparate. There is no specialized network available to the clubs. I think you're speaking of this younger players in Bègle, and that you've been able to have some consultations. In our region, Occitania, I'm in charge of the area around Toulouse. We have Hélène Donadieu in Montpellier, because we have many rugby clubs, and because we have many clubs in top 14 and Pro D second division, so we have lots of calls for consultation. So we told the national rugby, there's nothing right here. And so, of course, the message is in connection with substances. Well, you may have seen these pictures. The president of the National Society of Alcoholology pointed out, and you see here the journalists here are helping us. And as you can see, Emmanuel Macron, who did, in fact, he drank down through, well, this bottle of beer, actually, in the changing rooms of Stade Toulousain. You have all seen that.
Cul-de-sac, cul-de-sac,
cul-de-sac, yeah. But as you know, and you know, these two photographs are a source of problem, because when you make professional players, they tell you, but look, even the president is doing that. So it's not, well, this is the same happens in football. That was the Sun here, a picture of Alexandre Lacazette, Guendouzi, two players of Arsenal, who were taking in balloons. These are old photographs, and of course they received a sanction and were kicked out of the club. But so it's not only about rugby. And we have this association, Addiction France. In fact, here, of course, here again, we see this breach of law EVA on this advertising of World Rugby with this Japanese beer brand. And it says, well, drinking this beer will enrich the experience of every fan thanks to the unique taste of modern Japan. So when I think of modern Japan, this does not only relate to beer. But we know at least that the addiction is on the watch for this type of problems. So how can we identify and screen these issues? There are no overall evaluation. There's no addiction diagnosis, and they tell us we try to spot these people if there's a 16-year-old player drinking alcohol, and we try to address the issue. At what age should we try to do the screening? When you speak about young players, we looked at the rugby school my son plays, and my son is 12, and we watched that rugby match involving Ireland and said, what is Guinness? Why do you always see Guinness on this? And this is true, because 100% of the kids would tell, this is beer. So this means that the winner, Guinness, will offer them beer for the third half time. And this sends us back for what Amine said earlier about virgin mojito or sweets with mojito taste. And children are exposed at a very early age to images and that they know. And prevention starts when they're around the age of 14. But this is when we realize that we need to act even before. So everybody can identify, can spot that. I think this is a picture of Marc Auriacombe, who's going to tell you about this physiotherapist from Brive who produced a thesis about snus, because as a physiotherapist, he had identified a lot of consumption of snus, and he used this topic for his graduation dissertation and created a whole network of screening in the Brive Rugby Club. We also invited to do some experimentation to know about the substances, and this is a good point. We were invited to work with the league because the club physiotherapists didn't know what to do when they were faced with issues. So they would turn to addicto-vigilance services or toxicology. So it is interesting to have a network. So of course we have warning procedures. We now ask them to carry out some interviews, as George explained. So it's not because they celebrate during the halftime that everybody's fine. Some go to this third halftime because they are under peer pressure. And so we have some work, some players who've never drunk any alcohol, the same as we did, when health students go to those integration weekend and they're scared of those weekends because they would be forced to drink alcohol. So we sent that message and we're pretty happy of the results. It's somebody who is not doing well and who celebrates, it may be unnoticed, but it's up to the club's doctor to identify such people. So later on, we have this overall process, which includes depression, screening, depression, and actions. So we have this dual pathology, and so because on one side you have depression, use of substances, and our mission of training of doctors, club doctors and physicians is to work and now to also oppose this third level pathology, because we now have, in addition, we have to look also at some which have a joint consultation with different specialists. So, for example, we cannot each one after the other see doctors, so we must have a joint example. So you see a picture of Vincent Blasco-Baquet, who is a referee, but is also a professor of dental surgery in Toulouse. And we started working together on the issue as a dental surgeon. And we speak about the microbiota and disorders linked with the use of substances. He's pretty much interested in the composition of saliva and disruption and dysbiosis. And he's shown that, in particular, when players or people use snus or tobacco to chew or have 4 high level in carbohydrate meals a day, or drinks a lot of Red Bull, which is now the partner of rugby 7. And so we see many young people drinking lots of Red Bull, other lots of fluorescent drinks, as the dentists would say. And we see these numerous cases of dental decay, which and so we can identify those disorders very early because they can add up and make concussions even worse. And also, we no longer do functional surgery if they consume nicotine as tobacco or snus. We know nicotine is very harmful to scarring, especially with the Gilligan's tenderness, and they have extremely bad scarring. And for brain concussions, we know nowadays, and some rugby players have witnessed the fact that when they have repeated concussions, will want to consume more alcohol or opioid to calm their headaches, and a cohort is now being followed up in Europe, and we have observed increased consumption of alcohol without being able to identify then how to address that. And so the environment is the parents, that's on the field or in the rugby schools, and they tell us, okay, here is the alarming doctor. But in fact, it's just not about alarming people, but I tell people, that, well, the tournament starts at 9:30, so the children have 20-minute matches, and you come and hug your children, smoking a cigarette, and and having a pint of beer in the second hand. So you're not giving them the right model. And so there's a lot of information. So we also have our regional league, even Occitania is working in creating labels out, so some certificates of those rugby schools. And I don't know if you remember, there was this decree in 1996 that prohibited the sale of alcohol in the clubs, but the clubs say, well, this is why we make money. And so, but maybe not, or making some no alcohol refreshment stands in the clubs. So during the halftime, you can go and buy your drink, but there's such a long queue to buy your beer, so you don't have time. So there's some stadia have made some extra queues where you can buy with your credit card only for soft drinks, and people will drink less alcohol. And you may have seen this at Roland Garros, and we had many security interventions because people were drunk and would bother the tennis player. And we're trying to do this, and you often have these people, who walk around, serve beers, and these people now intend wasting time. And so we need to identify those new phenomena, just like snus, which I've already mentioned. And also we have to be on the watch out on the net. There's now this new website, which is called Healthy Living Starts with Rugby. And these people will sell nicotine patches, but also nicotine, to place under your tongue. So this website cannot operate in France, but this is exactly the first type of substance that can be purchased online. As I said, also there are many variable data according to the players, club, president, how to manage confidentiality, and also the importance of the peers. So we must, rely on the peers. This started with the Olympics. In rugby, we have now Raphaël Poulain, who wrote When I Used to Be Superman, and who explains, in fact, what is the collapse of a rugby player. He was one of the first who created theater play, which we use as a mediation tool. He has now created this association called Neo Heroes. They go around the clubs for awareness speeches. So we need to be supported by the league. This is the case, and this does help because, of course, clubs will now, of course, be willing to contribute. I once see a sports club who told us, but in fact, you're having a dangerous speech. Of course, we don't like cocaine, but you know, we're all the same generation. Doctor, haven't you ever come back home? Yeah, I mean, drunk driving from the rugby club. I said, sorry, I'm not part of those, and I think you can no longer speak like that anymore. And so what we do is we try to work as a group, and so we have those, awareness groups, and try to train those frontline players, and we would teach them to identify a mate who is not doing well, a club mate who is not doing well. So we'll have a group on the left, on the right, and then they will switch. Let's imagine if you're living a difficult period of time, and then you need to discuss solutions. On the right side, you see that one of your friends is undergoing a difficult period, is consuming cocaine. What would you do? And of course, they will have to share their viewpoints. And this is for professional players, and this is why we have also worked with an interpreter translating us to support these English-speaking players. And so we are, whether you're an academic teacher, there's now this university diploma in addictology, sports physicians also calling on us, and rugby medicine. And so there's going to be this diploma, and we will introduce a module on addictology. In rugby, we're currently confronted with mixed rugby, and women will play up to the age of 15 with a 14-year-old boy. There's this issue of consumption. They will be probably more mature than boys. And during these party evenings, we did this integration night, and the girls didn't have all the same problem. They just wanted to have hamburgers. And the girls complained because they want to have their mobile phone. They say, please, can you allow us 5 or 10 minutes slots to call our friends? And we know the issues are not at all the same with the older players. Volleyball coach told me that when girls, when they know, and when they competitions, or they try to stop their period, or take, type problems, to stop, having difficulties or pain might be linked to their period, and which one? Tramadol. So you see, I mean, it's a never-ending issue. Thank you for your attention. Yes, okay, well, alors, thank you very much, Nicolas. Okay, are there any questions or comments, observations? Nicolas, he's also spoke about the environment around addictions in the sports world, and this is extremely interesting. And thank you for mentioning Addiction France, which, as you may know, is the plea bearer of Loi Eva. And this is the only association. I'm also the president of Addiction France. So we have specific public funds to file a complaint when the even law has been reached. And we sometimes win against huge companies like Heineken. And during the Rugby World Cup, during the Olympic Games, and we can win because they don't mind, because even still, even if they're losing the suit, there's still kind of advertising for them. So as long as you're faced with a breach of this law ever, keep us informed. Let me give you an example. I was taking the train in Paris Montparnasse to go to a meeting with some colleagues in Rennes, and as I crossed this long corridor, you may know in that station, it's never-ending corridor on my left, and they would. You may have seen this advertisement. It was huge, so I took a photograph which I sent to France Lucas, a member of the association, and the week after he had filed a complaint, a suit. And so it was this agency, ATHS-2025, which, in the great cynicism of capitalism, offered us a campaign about of alcoholism among young people. So, but we won that lawsuit. Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, gentlemen. You know my interest for high-level sport and support. I work for Section Paloise, and I've worked a lot on trail. As you know, we had this race, Diagonale des Fous, 150 kilometers with an objective of performance. Everybody wants to be Alexandre Bouchek's. Running with that green cap, with this vision of performance, with this, upgraded human. And we have now seen appearing this phenomenon of bigorexia. We now see the appearance of steroids, anabolizers with challenges on TikTok, and you need to stop for and you must gain muscular mass in 30 days. And we now see athletes using substances without any support by the club, with pseudo coaches or self-proclaimed coaches who will ask people who do not have any experience or discussion with adults around those products. And these products will have a severe impact in their life. And the same with the use of proteins, BCA, and you think something else will appear. And there's this whole massive effect of dissemination and communication. And thank you for all the work you're doing. This is an excellent comment for a very simple reason, because I remember, you may as well, when you used to, register in a, sports club, you had humans then, and you were asked to produce a medical certificate, and you had been examined by your GP, and this doesn't appear anymore. So you just got to go, and you just must, waiver out the company's responsibility and say, yes, I'm very healthy. And they have put a defibrillator. And so with the development of these humanless, sports room and those influences who've built up mass supported with IA photos, we have this new system which is totally out of control. I think we definitely need to have some regulation there. This is the debate I once had about how can we intervene in sports club, but we have many female influencers also who promoted, this weight loss medication, and then we saw this case of these people with super skinny faces, and she said, what do you do? What if they buy online? So we cannot. And so I think there's an ongoing complaint about one of those influencers, but it is extremely difficult to regulate. Vegovy, yes, Vegovy faces, as they were called, because they lose weight extremely fast and they look like ghost-like faces. Are there any questions from the audience? Is everything fine? Well, thank you so much for your presentation. My question is more about, do you also target at amateur clubs in, rural areas? Do you observe any differences in consumption or risk-taking, or is it the same? In fact, I presented the action we're doing with the National Rugby League. So we also work with amateur clubs. Well, we are now structuring our action. It's easier because there is some action. So this is our season 1, and we may invite you, I think Jean-Pierre, in 2 years' time to report about the season 2 of our interventions. Of course, we are aware of the issues among amateurs, and there is no framework. But of course, we intervene in departmental committees, if I must go over the region of Toulouse, 09 and 31. So we try to gather them to have some joint action. But of course, amateur clubs and rugby schools also already concerns a lot of persons, because many of those kids coming out from rugby schools will remain amateur players. Thank you very much.
George is now going to have to leave. He's going to drive back. Thank you, George. While Michael comes in, just one word, a moment we were talking about, where is Augustin? Augustin is a coach, physical coach, and also an addictologist. Sports environment is not an easy environment to work in because when you have these depressed, unhappy sports people, either they have a lot of internal, external pressure for performance, but when things are not good, it's very complicated for them to ask for help because they're supermen or superwomen. It's impossible for them to go and ask for help because that's the kind of environment they're in. So they come into the health care circuit almost a bit too late. Because if you go to looking for help from the healthcare professionals, it's not easy. It's not easy to do. Thank you very much. I think that everything you've just said seems so important. Thank you. This is a spoiler, but I agree with everything you said, so that's fine. My name is Michaël BISCH. I'm a psychiatrist and addictologist. I work in Switzerland, in Neuchâtel, in a public hospital, and I'm going to be talking about clinicians need to know about mental health care for athletes in general, and particularly elite athletes, high-level athletes in particular. A moment ago, George started by giving a few definitions, and I'm going to perhaps look at that in more detail so that we're sure that we're all talking about the same thing. As you know, France loves writing rules, doesn't like to apply them, but it loves to draft rules and regulations. We have a sports code, which was mentioned a moment ago. It's actually quite unique internationally to have a particular legal document, a code covering sport. This is a code which governs all the rules for functions in sport, refereeing, for cheating and so on. And there's one goal, this code, is to establish a kind of equity so that the best person can win. In some sports, there are weight categories. It's a kind of equity so that the best player can win. That's sport. Sport is a set of rules that have been set up so that in a competition, the best person can win. And there's a definition of the sports person. I don't know if you've ever heard this definition of what a sports person is. In the code, it's anybody who takes part in a competition organized by a federation or with a prize, which is either money or some other kind of prize, or who prepares to participate in a competition. That's quite cool because that gives many sports people doing sports to be considered as a sportswoman, a sports person. If I run and I time my running, I'm doing sport. I'm a sports person because if I am timing my sport, there's emulation and performance, and I hope to be able to reach a certain score or improve my score. If I run, if I'm just listening to my body, being aware of my body with no performance goals, not very many people do that. Perhaps I'm just doing physical activity, and that's another definition. Physical activity is expenditure of energy which is higher than the expenditure of energy in a sedentary position in a thermally neutral area. So some sports have federations and organized competitions. Some of them expend less energy than perhaps doing housework. Some of them are not very heavy in terms of the amount of energy. But I don't think that skipping has a federation, but it represents a lot of energy. So sport and physical activity are not connected, and sometimes these definitions are not clear. Sedentarity is still another definition. I think you can see sedentarity is defined as the fact of being in a position, sitting or standing or lying down without moving in a thermally neutral area, without expending energy. Can you be a sportsman and be sedentary, a sports person and be sedentary? Yes, most sports persons say, no, I'm a sports person. That defines me. So I'm not sedentary. But you can be a sports person and be sedentary. You can be an elite athlete and be sedentary. Some sports require a lot of training in terms of the amount of time. If you're swimming and you spend 6 or 8 hours a day in water, in the water. It's difficult to be sedentary because as soon as you wake up, you have to go into the water and do some physical activity. But if you're a footballer, your average daily training is not much more than an hour. And I don't know if you've seen how it works in football clubs. You sit down with your tablet and your headphones, and the bus comes to take you to the changing room. You do your activity. The bus takes you back to your armchair. So you can be an elite athlete but still be sedimentary and have both the risks of intense physical activity and sedentarity. So sport can be protective, but it can also be associated with an accumulation of the risks of sedentarity and physical activity. Is that definition clear so I can move on to other definitions? What is doping? We haven't talked about it, I think, so far, the definition of doping. It's important because it's not a definition which can be superimposed on those of addiction, because it's not a behavioral definition, but it's a substance definition. There's no question about the behavior and the environment. It's the presence in biological samples of a forbidden substance at a time of competition or outside competition. So the mode of administration of the substance is there was a time when the Tour de France people said that they didn't know that they were being injected, but the presence in biological samples leads to a conviction for doping. So this is not something which is very interesting clinically. I've showed you a picture of, might seem a bit strange, but doping is not just an issue for human being. In human being, there is is a kind of restriction, but with animals, if you're doing horse riding, it's better to dope the horse rather than the jockey, although apparently there's also doping with jockeys because it depends on weight. So you have to keep your weight down, and they can potentially be using substances to do that. Doping behaviors have another definition, which is closer and can overlap that of addictions. And the difference is the goal. In addiction, the goal is to look for pleasure or to be able to relieve oneself from a lack of pleasure. But in sports, there's an objective. Doping, frequent, almost daily doping activity. I'll have a little test. Has anybody in this room drinking coffee has already drunk coffee for other reasons than the taste of the coffee? Practically everybody has drunk coffee for things other than taste. It is doping. It's to remain alert if I have to revise or I have to drive a car. It's not a very risky doping behavior, but it's the use of a psychoactive substance to overcome a real or imaginary obstacle. And of course, we know the definitions of addictions, of course. If we look at addiction to physical exercise, if it's not in the theme, it's not something that we can have a diagnosis and have structured prevention because it's not considered as a disease, but it's recognized by the WHO for some time now, and it's probably the hidden addiction because it hides behind an ultra-healthy lifestyle, including specific forms and bigorexia, as a well-known sports person, I think, who regularly in the media talks about his bigorexia and adds a relatively positive tone to this. This is Lazarazu, and it's a very positive dimension, I think, that he gives to that. There are several scales, but this is relatively well validated. It's interesting, and it's been translated into French. So the exercise dependence scale that's been revised, they're addiction criteria, quite simply. If you look at the elite athletes, these scales are difficult to apply. They do not discriminate very clearly because a reduction of the activities in daily life to practice sport, but that's their job to do sport if they're elite athletes. So that's not a discriminating factor. In 2019, therefore, the mental health group of the International Olympic Committee, so the largest industrial partner, the biggest partner in 2024 was with various I think, beer industries. But anyway, this is not the International Olympic Committee, but it's the Mental Health Working Group. We're working on specific criteria for normative physical exercise or physical exercise which could be considered addictive in the case of addiction. And I draw your attention to certain features. We can consider that it is normal that physical exercise should take a substantial time, and that other activities in life which are important for the individual may not be completely eliminated. If there is still some room for other activities, that's normative, and the criterion of addiction is elimination of all other activities of life. What does that mean? That means that you actually identify it late, because with criteria like that, early screening is almost impossible, because to be discriminating, if there were general population criteria, they would be considered normative. The ability to stop or cut down exercise as recommended. So if you're a professional sportsman, could you follow a training program, a federal training program? You don't know if you know what it's like, but the federations can have their training plans with various times and stages that you have to go through. Today, sports people in certain federations can benchmark themselves and see where they stand in terms of the percentage of the program, in terms of federal training programs, so that they can, in real time, sports people can benchmark. They're also tracked all the time with the anti-doping agency. They have to report where they are, so they can be tested on demand. They can benchmark amongst themselves. So what happens if 6 months later, the beginning of the training plan, they've reached 100% of the federation training plan? They've done everything, and perhaps at the end of the year they're doing 150 or 170%. And it's very rare that people should say, watch out, there's a problem here of overtraining. If they haven't been injured, you've done everything what you've done, because there's a value given to hard work. You need talent, you need to work hard. You can hear that very often. So there's an increase in the important awareness of this subject, because some federations have de-training programs for ends of careers or periods between competitions, because when you have this application which shows you what other people are doing and you can't do that because you're injured, there is a psychological impact which is pretty important. So these are criteria which don't really help for early screening. It's perhaps a shortcoming, but at least they do discriminate between the different practices. Today, do we have specialized skills in sports psychiatry? It's an emerging discipline. It exists above all in the United States, the sports psychiatrists. It's not a subspecialty which is referenced in most academic subspecialties in most countries, but overall it does have one interest, and that is not just focusing on performance. Psychology, sports psychology, which has existed for a long time, does some extremely interesting work, but the field of application of sports psychology today, unfortunately, is in the majority oriented towards psychological techniques to support performance. Typically, I'm doing BMX with very steep departures or whatever, and I've got good skills, I've worked well, but I can't speed up fast enough in the slope. You really need to unplug your fear to be able to go there. These are things that sports psychologists work on, so that you can have a kind of initial dissociation, so that you can go as fast as you can. But sports psychology can also be psychological support for disorders, but that's not the majority of the case. On the whole, it's focused on performance. Also very influential sports people like Teddy Riner. That's not Teddy Riner. But we're beginning to talk about their mental health. Teddy Riner talked about the coaching that he's had for the last 18 years or so with a psychologist. This is the Olympic site. It's much more problematic, I think, than the psychologist expressing herself. I think it's complicated for the psychologist to be talking about the experience of somebody that she is supporting. But there are some emerging discipline of sports psychology, therefore. I think it needs to be better clarified in terms of its field of application. And as was mentioned a moment ago in the discussion, it's not easy to bring athletes, and particularly elite athletes, to healthcare. With perhaps one first hindrance for the treatment gap is the stigma associated with this. It's self-stigmatization. They have to feel themselves as strong and infallible, and very often sports psychology tries to raise and remove this fear of defeat. A lot of young athletes, it changes with age, but a lot of young athletes consider that psychological suffering is a weakness more than in the general population. And if they're injured, they have to get up and say, it's okay, I'm good. Stefan Kung, a Swiss cyclist, in the European Championship, he was allowed to finish with this helmet in this state. So there's a risk of brain trauma. The problem is not whether he finished or didn't finish with the assessment, but it's the glorification of his courage, having finished the race in that state. And then athletes, whether they're amateurs or professionals, have always given priority to emotional verbalization with their staff, the coach and so on. Why? Because their conviction is that this first line of support will be able to do everything, whereas doctors outside sport are probably perceived as people who might tell them to stop, and that can be a hindrance to access to care that can be extremely complex. Another difficult thing in athletes, whether amateur or professional, in environmental terms, is early exposure to stress. This can make more acute psychiatric problems. So if you have this exposure to stress and high levels of cortisol from the start of adolescence when they're professional athletes, because most or a lot of professional athletes become professionals while they're still adolescents. The Williams sisters became professionals between 13 and 15. Today, the average draft for the NBA is they're about 20. The average time of their duration of their career is 5 years. So they're kids when they become professionals. They're removed from their family environment. So there is a change in their points of reference from that point of view. And the links with environment, they can be a supportive environment, but it can also be very complex because it's sometimes incomprehensible for the friends and family that their son, daughter, or whatever is not considered as the best in the high level. You're the best rugby player in school, best rugby player in the club, best rugby player in the region. And then if you come to a national team, I don't know the classifications, the top 14, all of a sudden you spend a lot of time on the sidelines, on the touchline. And people phone up and say, why didn't the coach keep you on the field? Why didn't you play? How come is he playing, not you? And so they are subjected to important family pressures. And these are pressures that are not malevolent, they're more serious things. But when you reach a high level, there are all sorts of people that you haven't spoken to for ages. They phone you up. There's a kind of target on your back. There's a cousin who you can't even remember who phones you and says he needs something. Your parents can do that too. Not long ago, there was an NBA player who was, his mother stole $11 million from him. So these are signs of a very early life in teenage years with very, very significant pressure. On the specific stress factors connected to sport, these adolescents and teenagers, young adults, need to respond to family, the needs of family, of representations too, if you can buy a house for your mother, whatever, or media treatment of their performance. and they're not necessarily equipped to look at that with the necessary distance. They have specific stress factors to reach and maintain the level so that they can remain in their current category. For example, cycling, which is an environment where doping seems to be endemic. Most of the cyclists who've been convicted of doping never doped to win. They knew that they wouldn't win, but they doped so that they could maintain their level and remain in the peloton. That's the case of most of doping cases. You talk a lot about cases of doping where the cyclists have won because their awards are stripped from them. But a lot of people don't win, but they still have an issue with doping. So you need to have relations with the coaches so that you can ensure that you're going to be selected to play. And so that is a very important relational question. And it also can have an effect on your sentimental life and so on. And I've spoken a little bit about your environment. You also have to manage your fortune. That depends on your sport. The NBA, if you've got $4 million in the first year, like a rookie, then managing your fortune is quite complex. The Americans have a lot of support there for the first week. They have a lawyer. It's very expensive, costs several thousands of dollars, but it's so that you don't lose millions of dollars. And few athletes escape from that. I think Professor Franchitto showed an example of somebody who is a professor and a sports referee. And that made me think of two things. That is the legitimacy for sport. He's more legitimate probably in the world of sport because he's a rugby referee, because he's a professor of odontology, and sports people don't care about that. So, but he can use those skills. The legitimacy of health professionals like psychiatrists and addictologists with sports people, it's not acquired by their scientific qualifications. But, for example, to prescribe methadone is a lot easier. It's not too complicated to be legitimate to do that in the eyes of the patient. But being legitimate to talk about, to talk to a sports person without having a good understanding of the sports environment is much more complicated. And that's why this mental health working group of the Olympic Committee says you can't do anything for sports people without being approved by the sports people themselves. Perhaps there's Jan Schroep, who's a former sports doctor who's been European champion in 2,000 meters. So he says, I want to be an amateur athlete. What it really means is he's saying, leave me alone. But you have a profession, you're a sports doctor, and so on. So how can you gain people's trust, the trust of these athletes? Professor Franchitto said that you need to reassert professional secrecy, but reinforcing also your assertion. And you have to ensure that that has been fully understood, that is that nobody can make me break my professional secret, because their perception may be that they could be betrayed one way or another. So you have to recall this regularly and verify that that has been fully understood. And not ask for anything. That means don't ask for autographs, no selfies. Why? Because the posture is important. And what you need to show athletes is that you show empathy and interest for the person and not for their skills. So I don't necessarily agree with Teddy Rina's psychologist and saying they're exceptional people. No, she's following normal people who have exceptional skills. And if she's following exceptional people, she's like us, she's fascinated. We all have our limits. If you, I don't know, if I'm with Stephen Curry, I'm not going to go and say, if Stephen Curry comes to consult, I'm not going to go and say, go and see somebody else. But we need to have this ability, and you need to prove it. The problem is that we don't have much time, because they're all the obstacles to establishing this relationship, and the careers are short, so we don't have much time. It's a very active approach that's required to establish this climate of confidence and trust. On support for addictology, most athletes come because they've had an inspection. It's not voluntary. The treatment gap is enormous. The level of access to healthcare is less good than that of the general population, perhaps because it's experienced as a weakness, but with inspections and tests, it's because your career might be in jeopardy. So if you have a control of a forbidden substance, and then you can see athletes coming in, and you could ask them for anything. They would be at the mercy of ill-intentioned persons because they have no goal. They say, just tell me what I have to do so I can start playing again. Not to go better, so I can continue to compete. How can I repair that problem? Everything is acceptable in terms of management if it means they can play again. It's a moment of great vulnerability because elite athletes, particularly if they have money, are targeted by a lot of charlatans. And they would tell them that they're the only people who can help them, and promise them that with what they're going to do, they're going to be able to play again quickly. So you need to develop an alliance. It's longer, and you don't have much time to act because the careers are so short. And pharmacotherapy, there are different considerations that need to be taken into account because it can be seen as a kind of punishment, because in some cases, I've given you an example here of the current list of the anti-doping agency. There's methadone. These are on the substances of list of forbidden substances. It doesn't mean you can't prescribe it, but what does the sportsman have to do? A sportsperson do? They have to say it and ask for an exemption. They have to say, "I'm weak. I'm sick. I need a treatment," and you need screening. And it has to be. You have to also look for psychiatric comorbidity because the treatment gap is very large. There's a risk that people are not going to be consulting for a psychiatric problem, but when they come in, when they have a substance use problem. I'd like to thank, I wanted to do it at the end of this presentation, Stephen Taylor. This presentation is very much inspired by what we've done together and his work with the NBA. He's the president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and for 20 years he was the medical director of the anti-drug program of the NBA, with approximately 240 players under his responsibility. And if I had to end with one of his sentences, for 20 years he said that overall he had to fight so that players could tell him something, because as an anti-drug doctor, all the players refused to talk to him. So thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much for these clarifications, and thank you for referring to our friend Stephen Taylor. Do you have any questions, remarks, comments, and so on? Please, if you can be short, because I think I wanted to know whether in elite athletes, whether there are particular personality traits to reach that level, perhaps. There are personality traits. Could that be a source of fragility and a factor of risk for the development of addictions? So this is, again, prevention. I didn't say I was following elite athletes, but are there vulnerability factors that can be identified at an early stage and which could make it possible in terms of prevention to do more early screening? There are several studies on this, but they're not specifically based on addiction. But indirectly, there are studies, for example, on the CBCL score, which is the score of children's behavioral disorders, which are externalized or internalized. And these are compared arbitrarily with types of sport and the frequency. And team sports, contact-free sports, where, for example, it's in the group, they're more interesting. But what is systematically favorable is the frequency to have lower CBCL scores, rather like with fruit and vegetables. That's perhaps not a very good example. There's 5 fruits and vegetables a day, but you can't eat them all at the end of the month. In the same way, the family investment and the regularity in the sports practice of young people is a protective factor with regard to the CBCL scores. But there are also some elements which are currently being investigated still of a kind of missing link between addictions and performance. That's PDH. I think this is a study currently underway. I think Professor Dominier is coordinating that and looking for the prevalence of TDAH, that's attention disorders in elite athletes, young athletes. Or if you remove inhibitions, you can be better. Or there's certain personalities like high sensation seeker profiles. You need certain extremely high levels of sensation so that you have a satisfactory trigger of your autonomous system. Thank you very much. The remark that you just made is very interesting because we tend to think that activity can replace codified plans. People say, yes, I've done a lot of sport. Yes, this means that I don't have to take matidine or whatever. No, these treatment for attention deficiency disorders is a medical issue that needs appropriate treatment. Do you have questions for Michael? Okay, well, I think you're hungry, so are we, so thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all the speakers, and thank you for resting until the end of the session.